Alright everyone, wands up. Now, repeat after me. Avada. What? Are you serious? Okay, fine, I'll start with the basics. Today, I'm going to talk about how to play effective spellcasters on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who knows the most powerful curse in existence, the Forever GM curse. It's heartless, you should not do it to people, trust me. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today I'm going to be visiting a topic that is something of a passion topic for me, and that is spellcasting. If you've followed this channel for any length of time, you know that my favorite character concept is the wizard. I love the concept of the person who is poring over old tomes and researching lost secrets and unlocking the building blocks of the universe. I love spellcasting. If I'm very technical, my very first D&D character was a ranger, but the first character that really stuck with me, it was a wizard. And to this day, spellcasters are just my favorite archetype in any RPG that you can think of. I have been playing spellcasters for years, and anytime that I'm going to try out a new role-playing game, the first thing I look at is spellcaster concepts because I always just find those very interesting. However, let's be honest. Spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e has garnered a bit of a negative reputation. I have seen comments many different places on the internet that essentially argue that spellcasters in Pathfinder 2e just aren't as strong as they should be, just aren't as effective as other classes, and don't contribute to the team in the way they might have in previous editions of the game. Now, as a game master who has seen the party cleric ruin boss fights on multiple occasions with the well-timed placement of just a single spell, I know that spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e is still very potent and very effective, but I do recognize that that perception is there, and it is one of my goals with this channel to help people recognize that spellcasting is not a dead art in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. There is still a lot of might to the magic that is available, and if I have the opportunity to offer a little bit of wisdom that can help a new level 1 spellslinger as they start their career, I'm more than happy to do so, because at the end of the day, I want everyone who plays this game to get something wonderful out of this game. Now, my channel has already started tackling this issue through the short series that I have been doing, where I've been highlighting different spells in Pathfinder 2e that I think are fun or have interesting applications, and I've been generating some good conversations and some good comments back and forth from those shorts, but I also wanted to do a longer look at the topic of spellcasting. And this video is going to be my first deep dive into the subject of spellcasting and how it is used inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition. I'll go ahead and tell you, it is beyond the scope of a single video to talk about all of the nuances and applications of spellcasting, but I want this to be a sort of spellcasting 101 to help players who are trying out spellcasters in Pathfinder 2e get a good grip on at least how they can get started playing one of the many fantastic spellcasters inside of this game. So get your scrolls ready. We're going to be looking at a few different topics in today's video. First, I'm going to offer a little bit of a history lesson on spellcasting in D20 role-playing games to help compare and contrast Pathfinder 2e to the games that have come before. Then, we're going to talk a little bit about understanding spellcasting, and we're going to focus in on the concept of schools, traditions, and essences to help us understand what spellcasting can do inside of the game. Then, for the third part of this video, we actually have a guest professor. Drew from Team Party Gaming is going to be dropping in to talk about spellcasting and teamwork. And then, I'll wrap up this video by talking about diversifying your modes of attack and expanding access to your spell options inside of the game. So, let's get started. Now, when it comes to Pathfinder 2nd Edition, as I've already noted, there is a little bit of pushback that has happened in the gaming community. People who feel like spellcasting just isn't as viable in this game as it is in other RPGs that are out there. And while I think that spellcasting is well done in Pathfinder 2e, I think that there is a kernel of truth to the complaints that are out there, and I think if we take a look at how spellcasting lines up in 2e versus other games, it can help us understand what the game designers intended for spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e. Now, summarizing every difference in spellcasting from Pathfinder 2e to Pathfinder 1e to Dungeons & Dragons 5e and all of the other fantasy RPG games that are out there would be an immense task. But I think that there is one fundamental difference that you can highlight in Pathfinder 2e to really understand the game design principle to spellcasters, and that is Pathfinder 2nd Edition has removed what some players call the save or suck element of spellcasting that has been seen in other fantasy RPGs. For those of you who may not be familiar with that terminology, the basic premise is, for a lot of spells in many different role-playing games, there's a binary option of either the spell works or it doesn't. You get the effect or you don't get the effect, and there's no middle ground between those two options. So in a lot of games, when you're a wizard or a bard or a cleric or something like that, when you throw out a spell, you are either going to get the full effect of the spell or no effect whatsoever, hence the term save or suck. And save or suck can go both ways. A monster that fails its save, especially against higher level spells, can be knocked out of the fight in a single turn. One powerful spell has the potential to completely end one of the targets that your party is facing. By the same token, if you are a player who fails a save, then it kind of sucks to sit at the gaming table because your character's out of the fight, possibly dead, and you just get to sit there for 2 hours while the rest of your friends play the game. This example of extremes of outcome when it comes to spellcasting is an interesting thing to observe because people don't like it, but they don't like to let go of it. A lot of people hate the save or suck concept when it comes to spells, and a lot of people will tell you that save or suck is bad game design, that it sucks the fun out of the game. And I'm not the only person who would make an observation like this. Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition gives powerful monsters something known as legendary resistances, which is the game master can literally just say, this monster made the saving throw. No, that spell doesn't work. The designers of D&D 5e recognize that knocking the boss monster out with a single spell fired off the very first turn of combat is not fun. And I know that as a game master, I have often been very reluctant to use save or suck spells against my players because I don't want to knock them out of the game and steal their fun. In fact, I remember the last time I actually used a phantasmal killer spell against one of my players, and I deliberately targeted the party member I knew that had the best chance of making their saving throws because I didn't want someone to just sit at the table and not have fun. When we talk about save or suck, we need to realize it kind of sucks and it doesn't make for much fun when it comes to gameplay. And so in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, one of the things that they did is, instead of having this binary outcome when it comes to spells, it happens or it doesn't, they created instead a scale of outcomes that apply to most of the spells in the game. And this is the 4 degrees of success that you're familiar with if you've played Pathfinder 2e. You have critical success, success, failure, and critical failure. and often those 4 degrees come with very different outcomes relative to one another, and it's worth noting that the most extreme outcomes happen on the critical success and the critical failure, meaning that the normalized outcome of spells in Pathfinder 2e is a lot less dramatic than it is in other role-playing games. This leads to what I think is one of the most important things to realize about spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e. Paizo has taken a hard look at the game balance of spells. Spellcasting should be fun, and you should feel powerful, and you should have an impact on the game, but at the same time, Paizo wanted to develop a system that was more normalized, more reliable, where you had a better idea what that impact was going to be. I actually think it's kind of interesting. My wife, for years, refused to play spellcasters in role-playing games because she hated the save or suck mantra, and now, Pathfinder 2nd Edition, she actually likes playing spellcasters because the majority of the time, she's going to have some effect on her spells. She prefers that normalization because it's easier for her to make predictions about what the outcome of her actions are going to be. And this is, I think, where a lot of the dilemma comes from. If you're used to the older versions of spellcasting, sometimes save or suck is amazing. I once knocked a CR21 red dragon out of a fight in a single round and completely saved my party with a lucky bad saving throw on the part of that dragon. It's an awesome memory. But at the same time, I can also remember many old games where I threw out spells and they completely fizzled, and I just kind of wasted my turn and had to wait forever for another opportunity to come around and hope that one of my spells landed. I think a lot of the dilemma over Pathfinder 2e and spellcasting boils down to people have become used to the extreme version of spellcasting, and this more normalized or bell curve distribution of outcomes is kind of a strange place to be in. Overall, I feel like Paizo has brought the game to a good point by making this decision to push the game to a more normalized outcome for spellcasters and pushing those extreme outcomes to the most extreme roles that happen inside the game. So that's one element that I think has changed in Pathfinder 2e relative to a lot of other role-playing games, but there's another change that I think people might be overlooking that I think is also impacting our perception of spellcasting in Pathfinder 2e, and that is encounter design in Pathfinder 2e gives spellcasters fewer targets. So one of the strange things that I've noticed telling a lot of Pathfinder 2e games is relative to Pathfinder 1st Edition, most encounters, especially moderate encounters and higher, are often balanced around a fewer number of targets that have stronger attacks and stronger resistances rather than a variety of small targets. Now, as a game master, you can build encounters that have a number of small, weak targets, but there is a subtle push in the game design towards fewer, more interesting, more powerful monsters. And that does impact spellcasting to a degree, because quite often when you think of spellcasting, you think of spells like Fireball. You think about dropping elemental damage on a huge area and just blasting everything in sight. And when you're talking about a game where, on average, you're going to have slightly fewer targets to drop that fireball on, ultimately you're going to deal less damage, and that fireball is going to feel less impactful. Now, I'm not saying that Area of Effect or AoE spells are completely worthless in Pathfinder 2e. I have certainly seen them used very well on a number of occasions, but relative to other fantasy RPGs, the AoE Blast spell ends up not being as useful as frequently as it has been in other games, and if you're not aware of that subtle difference between different systems, especially if you haven't sat behind the Game Master screen, you might not know why you're frustrated, but you definitely could feel frustrated that you don't think you're doing as much as a spellcaster. And that kind of highlights one of the common debates that I see around spellcasting in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, which is, I think best labeled the damage debate. Spellcasting is not effective because spellcasters just can't do as much damage as the fighter, or as the barbarian, or as the ranger, etc., etc. Now, I've seen a lot of debates back and forth about single target design versus multi-target design, and I don't want to dive into all of that here, but I do think it's beneficial to stop and just highlight this concept. A lot of the debate around the effectiveness of spellcasters in Pathfinder 2e boils down to damage. Spellcasters feel like they aren't doing the damage, so they feel like they aren't contributing to the team. And I'm going to be honest, as a longtime Wizard player, this is a really weird debate for me. I remember back in the golden days of 3.0 and 3.5 D&D, massive debates occurring where people went out of their way to say, as a spellcaster, it was all about control. It was all about charming your enemies. It was all about changing the battlefield. Controlling the battlefield was immensely more effective than just throwing out some points of damage. Let the barbarian hit things. It's your job to control the battle itself. It's weird for me because in 2 decades of gaming, we've gone from debates where the sole measure of the effectiveness of spellcasters is how well they control the battlefield, to now the sole determining factor of is a spellcaster good or not is do they do enough damage. It's like this script has completely flipped and we have found ourselves on the opposite extreme. Now, resolving that decades-long debate between control and damage and what spellcasters should be doing is definitely a tangent we don't have time for here. But I think this highlights that when it comes to spellcasting, we need to rethink how we evaluate spellcasting to make a better decision about whether or not we're contributing to the team and whether or not we're effective inside of the game. Spellcasting has changed. Paizo, I think, has been very deliberate about how they want spellcasting to affect the game, but we have to be mindful of how we evaluate spellcasting if we truly want to understand how to play a spellcaster well. So now that we've highlighted some of the differences, let's move on to understanding spellcasting so that we can learn how to evaluate the spells we want to use. Now, one quick thing that I want to say before we dive too far into this video is that as part of researching this video, I actually reached out to the Pathfinder 2e Reddit community to get a lot of feedback from them on how to play spellcasters effectively and on the things they have found when it comes to playing spellcasters effectively. It would be impossible for me to highlight every single person who offered advice and gave some great feedback, but I do want to say I got a ton of great feedback from Reddit. I'm going to throw some names into the credits on this video of some of the people who were giving feedback to that conversation, because credit where credit is due, there is a great Pathfinder 2e community out there that is more than willing to offer advice and insight, and there are certainly plenty of people who had some great ideas to share. So thank you to everyone who chimed into that conversation. And if you're looking for ideas beyond what I discuss in this video or in future videos on this topic, I strongly encourage you to reach out to some of the Pathfinder 2e communities out there, because there are a lot of great people who are more than willing to give you advice and offer some insight to help you out on questions like these. So when it comes to understanding spellcasting in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, there is some game terminology that is helpful when you begin to start evaluating spells and their utility inside of the game. Today we're going to focus on 3 specific terms that the game uses: traditions, essences, and schools. Now, the information on spellcasting can be found in the core rulebook from pages 297 to pages 306. And honestly, it's a pretty quick read, and taking 2 or 3 passes through that section can probably go a long way in helping you understand spellcasting and evaluating the spells that you have available. In particular today, we're going to be focusing on schools, which are found on pages 297 and 298. We're going to be talking about traditions, which can be found on page 299, and we're going to be talking about magical essences, which are found on page 300. And these terms serve a basic function, which is they help you understand what a spell is supposed to do and how a spell is classified. Now, the biggest classification here is tradition. Tradition is the term that determines your spell list as a spellcaster. There are 4 traditions in the game: Arcane, Divine, Occult, and Primal. Wizards are the classic example of arcane spellcasters. Clerics are the classic example of divine spellcasters. Druids carry that torch for the primal spellcasting tradition. And bards have become the official standard bearer for the occult tradition in Pathfinder 2e. When you play a spellcasting class, you will have one of these 4 traditions, and that tradition sets your spell list. So regardless of what class you're playing, if you have the arcane spell list, you will have access to all of the arcane spells. It doesn't matter if you are an evoker wizard, or an imperial bloodline sorcerer, or a magus. All of them will use the same spell list. By the same token, the oracle and the cleric both use the divine tradition as their spell list. So tradition is basically a catch-all term for the spell list that your character has access to. There will be other things inside of the game that might expand your spell list a little bit. For example, clerics might gain access to new spells based on their deity. But at the end of the day, tradition is the basis of your spell list and can be seen as a shorthand for which spells you have access to. But now we raise the question, how are those spell lists built? And that's where essences come in. Pathfinder 2e divides magic into 4 types of essences: material, spiritual, mental, and vital. Material essence spells are all about affecting the world around them, changing the world, shaping the world, maybe calling creatures to you. A good example of material essence spells would be, well, things like Disintegrate, where you literally just destroy that object in front of you. In fact, a little bit counterintuitively, a lot of blasting spells actually fall into the material essence category because blasting spells are all about impacting the world around you. So if you want to be a spellcaster who wants to leave their mark on the world, Burning Hands is a good choice for you. I mean, it's a scorch mark, but hey, it works. Vital essence spells are spells that manipulate life and living creatures, or conversely, undead creatures. Spells that deal positive and negative energy that heal or harm. And, well, heal and harm are both excellent examples of vital essence spells. Mental and spiritual are a little bit harder to distinguish from one another, but spiritual relates to the soul, and is often associated with the divination or necromancy schools. A good example of spiritual spells would be things like Detect Alignment or Protection from Alignment. Meanwhile, mental spells are all about affecting the mind itself, altering what a creature perceives, or even attempting to wrest control of a creature's mind. Enchantment and illusion spells often fall into this category. I'll admit the line between spiritual and mental can be a little bit blurry from time to time, but it is a distinct game term, and Paizo does make an effort to design its spells around these 4 different categories. Now we ask the question, how do traditions and essences relate? Well, every tradition is built from 2 different essences of magic, and no tradition shares the same 2 essences. Rather, the traditions overlap 2 other traditions, with each tradition sharing about 50% of their spells with another tradition inside the game. The arcane tradition has the mental and material essences as the primary sources for its magic. This overlaps with the primal tradition, which also has access to material essence spells, but the primal tradition switches out the mental essence and instead uses the material essence and the vital essence as the source for its magic. Moving further on, the divine tradition is the classic healer, so you expect them to have the vital essence, but then they also have the spiritual essence as a source for magic. And then the last tradition, the occult tradition, uses the spiritual and mental essences for their spells. And so you can see every tradition kind of halfway overlaps with 2 of the other traditions in the game. Arcane shares some of its spells with the primal tradition and some of its spells with the occult tradition, and has very little overlap, or next to none at all, with the divine tradition. and you could go around the whole circle of traditions, kind of seeing how those spells layer on top of one another. Magical traditions are not necessarily unique in the spells that they use, but they are unique in the combination of spells that they have access to, and understanding the combination of spells that they have access to will help tell you what the different magical traditions are intended for inside of the game. So if we look at tradition and essences as sort of the big divisions of spells into their large grouping of effects and into their particular spell lists, then you can think of spell schools as a more detailed look at what the particular effects of a spell are intended to be. Now, Pathfinder 2e continues with the classic 8 traditions of spellcasting that it inherited from Pathfinder 1e and before that from games like Dungeons & Dragons. The 8 traditions are abjuration, conjuration, divination, enchantment, evocation, illusion, necromancy, and transmutation. Abjuration spells, which are fairly common across all traditions, are protective spells. They are spells that are intended to interact with other magic and protect you in some form from other attacks. Examples of this would include the Mage Armor spell. Conjuration spells are all about bringing objects to you or bringing creatures to you or even teleporting around the battlefield, and the classic example of conjuration spells would be the summon spells that are available to different classes. Divination spells are about giving you information, allowing you to sense remote locations, and can even have fortune or luck effects inside of the game. A good example of a divination spell would be a spell such as Detect Poison. Enchantment spells will almost universally come with the mental trait and will often have other traits such as the emotion trait tagged onto them, depending upon the specific effect of the spell in question. A good example of an enchantment spell is a spell like Fear. Evocation spells are probably the first spells that come to your mind when you think of wizards and other spellcasters, because evocation spells, by and large, are considered to be the blaster spells. It's about summoning bolts of lightning or fireballs and just blasting away at the battlefield, but that's not all that evocation spells can do. You can also create things like balls of fire to help shape the battlefield. A good example of a low-level evocation spell is a spell like Burning Hands. Illusion spells are all about messing with the senses of your enemies. Messing with the sight, the smell, the hearing of your enemies, and making it where they cannot correctly perceive what is going on in the battlefield around them. That is the hallmark of illusion. Illusion spells also frequently have the mental trait, and will frequently come with traits such as auditory or visual to help describe which senses the spell is messing with. A classic example of an illusion spell would be a spell like Ventriloquism. Now, one of the big changes that Paizo made in Pathfinder 2e is they made healing spells necromancy spells. Necromancy is defined as the school of magic concerned with life and death. So positive energy, negative energy, healing and harming, these are the kinds of effects that are associated with the necromancy school. And then finally you have transmutation, which is all about physically modifying the world around you, potentially enhancing creatures or objects to your benefit. A good example of this would be a spell such as Magic Weapon. Now, when you take all of these things together, you begin to classify and categorize different spells, and it helps you understand what the spell is intended to do inside of the game. And by the same token, when you understand these categories, it helps you to better decide what sort of spells are going to help you accomplish your goals inside of the game. If you're interested in dealing damage, you're probably looking for evocation spells. Evocation is the classic blaster-caster archetype, and there are certainly other damaging spells available, but the ability to call fire and lightning and cold to damage your foes, that's probably one of the core things that you want to look at. So if your desire is to deal a lot of damage as a spellcaster, you probably want to look at evocation. Most evocation spells are material essence spells, which means that you probably want to look at a class that offers either the arcane or primal tradition. Knowing what you want to do with your character can help you identify which tradition of magic is going to be the most helpful, and from there, which classes are going to give you access to the spells that will help you best do what you're trying to accomplish. And this is where I feel like I should pause and point out what is a fairly simple but very important point in this conversation. If Blastercaster is largely the domain of evocation, again, not exclusively, but If evocation is really where you want to go for Blastercaster, please take note that is one of 8 possible schools. In other words, that's 1/8 of what spellcasting is capable of. Listen, I'm a fan of fireballs, I'm a fan of boom effects, I don't play subtle characters, I love a good AoE. But one thing we should be aware of is if we get too narrow a perception of what spellcasting is and what spellcasting can do, we're going to walk away with a negative opinion of spellcasting inside of the game. Yes, spellcasting has damaging options. Yes, spellcasting has control options and summoning options and morph and polymorph effects so you can turn yourself into a literal beast on the battlefield. Spellcasting has an array of different options inside of the game, and one of the things that is important in playing a spellcaster well is realizing you can't limit yourself to just one lane or one understanding of what a spellcaster is supposed to be. You have unlocked the secrets of the universe. You can do more than just drop a fireball here or there. But now that we've talked about understanding spellcasting, the next thing we need to talk about is spellcasters as part of a team. Now, it's something of a joke that in other fantasy RPGs and in earlier editions of fantasy RPGs, that spellcasters became so phenomenally powerful that eventually they didn't even need the rest of their team. Why do you need a fighter when you just hold the primordial elemental creature bursting forth from that arcane gate that it needs to go make you a sandwich because it just failed a will save? As we noted earlier, Paizo has normalized the effects of spells where the extreme outcomes are not nearly as common, and because of that normalization and because extreme effects are much less common, that means that the spellcaster's role in a team is a lot more prominent than it has been in past versions of the game. So, if you want to be an effective spellcaster, that means you need to be prepared to evaluate your spellcasting in terms of how well it plays with your teammates. And to help us with that conversation, I've brought in a visiting guest professor. Drew from Team Player Gaming is here to talk to us about spellcasting and teamwork. Take it away, Drew.
Thanks, tour guide. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Drew and I run the Team Player Gaming YouTube channel, a channel all about the teamwork aspects of tabletop RPGs. Today I want to talk about 2 things. Number 1, why is teamwork so vital to Pathfinder 2e? And secondly, how you can use spells to help your team. So why is teamwork so vital in Pathfinder 2e? Put simply, it's because that's what it was built around. Those of you that have played the system before, think about it. Have you ever had an encounter that just seemed way more difficult than it should have been? Well, part of the reason may have been that your party wasn't working as a team. Some classes are better at this than others, but everyone can contribute to the team in some way. You just have to start thinking of the team as a whole instead of just yourself. So how can you help your team as a spellcaster? Well, there are a number of different ways. The first one I want to talk about is buffs and debuffs. This is an obvious but very important one. Even a +1 or a -1 is huge in this system, especially to armor class. Armor class in this system isn't about not getting hit. It's about not getting critically hit. Even at high levels, a +1 to armor class could prevent you from being critically hit. This is why buffs are so important. Debuffs could allow you to crit when you normally wouldn't. Now let's look at some examples. We will start with the Haste spell. This is a 3rd level transmutation buff spell that is available to primal, occult, and arcane spellcasters. It has a range of 30 feet and targets 1 creature. For 1 minute, the target is quickened, but it can only use the extra action for stride or strike actions. So essentially, it can use the extra action to attack or to move. Once you can cast 7th level spells, you can target up to 6 creatures, which most of the time is going to be your entire party. This spell is especially good if you put it on a melee fighter, like a monk or a barbarian. This spell would allow the monk to attack with his unarmed strikes 5 times in 1 turn. This spell is also really good for spellcasters that need to reposition. Most spellcasters don't want to be in melee combat, so being able to have an extra action to move out of the way of something is fantastic for them. We talked about a buff spell, now let's talk about a debuff spell. Frightened is one of the best debuffs in the entire game. It affects literally everything, including armor class and skill checks. Frightened 1 is a -1 to everything, Frightened 2 is a -2 to everything, so on and so forth. By extension, the Fear spell is one of the best low-level debuff spells in the game. It is a level 1 enchantment spell that is available to all spellcasters. It has a range of 30 feet and can target one creature. However, once you can cast 3rd level spells, it can target up to 5 creatures, which most of the time is the entire enemy party. When you cast this spell, the target or targets must make a will saving throw. If they critically succeed on their saving throw, then the spell does not affect them. It does nothing. On a regularly successful saving throw, the target is Frightened 1. On a failed saving throw, the target is Frightened 2. If the target or targets critically fail their saving throw, then they are Frightened 3 and fleeing for 1 round. The Frightened condition does go down by 1 every round, but it's still a fantastic debuff and should definitely be used. Keep in mind that Frightened does stack with Flat-Footed, which is a -2 to AC. The next concept I want to cover for teamwork spellcasting is battlefield control. These are the types of spells that can force your opponents to waste actions. For my first example of this, I want to talk about the Tanglefoot spell. Tanglefoot is a conjuration cantrip that is available to arcane and primal spellcasters. When you cast this spell, you must make a spell attack roll against the armor class of one creature within 30 feet. If you critically hit, then the target is immobilized and takes a -10 foot penalty to speed for 1 round. It can attempt an escape check against your spell DC to end these effects. If you regularly hit with this spell, then the target takes a -10 foot penalty to its speeds for 1 round. Just like the critical success effect, it can make an escape check to end this condition. If you fail the spell attack roll, you just miss. When you can cast 2nd level spells, this effect lasts for 2 rounds. When you can cast 4th level spells, the effects last for 1 minute, which is basically the entire combat. Why is this spell good for teamwork? Well, a -10 foot penalty to speed could be the difference between the opponent having to use 2 actions to get to a target or 1 action. Also, if you critically succeed on the attack roll, then it forces the opponent to attack someone near to him unless they spend an action to escape. This is probably going to be some kind of melee fighter like a champion or a fighter, which wants to be in melee combat with them. And if they do attempt to escape, they're spending an action on that. Pretty much no matter what, this spell is going to force them to spend multiple actions to do what they want. And it might not even let them do what they want. For my second example of battlefield control, I want to talk about Black Tentacles. Black Tentacles is a 5th level conjuration spell that is available to arcane and occult spellcasters. The range is 120 feet and it takes up a 20-foot burst area. Each round, you make a spell attack roll against the Fortitude DC of every creature in the area. All creatures that you succeed against are grabbed by the tentacles and take 3d6 bludgeoning damage. Any creatures that are already grabbed take 1d6 bludgeoning damage. The DC to escape these tentacles is equal to your spell DC. This spell is a fantastic way to start off if you want to sit back and do ranged attacks against any creatures that are caught by this spell. Grabbed also means that the targets are flat-footed, which of course makes it easier for everyone to hit them. If you use this spell right, then the opponent can't do anything except try to escape. Great teamwork spell, especially if you have a bunch of ranged attackers in the party. The last teamwork aspect of spellcasting I want to talk about is healing. But I'm not just talking about healing hit point damage. That is important, but there are other spells that can remove debuffs. For my first example, I'm going to cover the Remove Fear spell. Frightened is one of the worst debuffs to be under because it affects everything, including attack rolls, AC, spell attack rolls, spell DCs, AC, all sorts of things. Being able to counteract that with a spell is huge, especially if the target is like Frightened 2 or something. Unfortunately, this spell isn't available to arcane casters, but it is available to every other spellcaster. But an even better debuff remover is the Restoration spell. It is a 2nd level necromancy spell that is available to divine, occult, and primal spellcasters. Sorry wizards, this spell is not for you. It takes 1 minute to cast this spell. It is a touch spell that can target one creature. When you cast this spell, you must choose whether to lessen a toxin or a condition. If you choose to lessen a toxin, reduce its stage by 1. However, you cannot cure the toxin with this spell. If you choose to reduce a condition, reduce the value of the target's clumsy, enfeebled, or stupefied condition by 2. You can also reduce 2 of these conditions by 1 each. Casting this spell at 4th level allows you to reduce the drain condition. Also, when you lessen a toxin, reduce its stage by 2 instead of 1. You can also reduce the target's doomed value by 1, but you can't use it to reduce a permanent doomed condition. Casting this spell at 6th level will allow you to do everything that 4th level restoration will allow you to do, but you can also reduce a permanent doomed condition if you add a spellcasting action and a material component while casting the spell. The material component must be 100 GP worth of diamond dust. A lot of really good poisons also inflict debuffs, so either way you use this spell, it's very good for teamwork. And that's going to wrap up my part of this video. If you want to see more Pathfinder 2e teamwork related content, you can absolutely check out my YouTube channel. I'm sure there'll be a link in the description somewhere. Enjoy the rest of this video, and remember, teamwork is vital. Back to you, tour guide.
Thank you so much, Drew. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your insight. Drew's channel here on YouTube focuses a lot on teamwork inside of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and his channel is just starting to grow. I'm going to throw a link to one of his videos up here, and I'm also going to throw a link to one of his videos down in the video description. I strongly encourage you to go check him out, check out some of his content, and maybe even subscribe to his work. He's doing fantastic things over there on Team Player Gaming. But now that we've talked about teamwork when it comes to spellcasting, there's one last topic that I want to address in this video, and that is diversification as a spellcaster. Both diversifying the way that you attack your enemies and also diversifying your access to spells. So one of the important things to note when it comes to effective spellcasting is spellcasters, for better or worse, largely do not get item bonuses when it comes to their spell attack rolls or to their spell save DCs. And this is an argument that we could spend way too much time on. I just think it's important to recognize that as a spellcaster, your raw aggressive power in any one lane of attack is not going to line up perfectly with other classes. A fighter with legendary proficiency in his sword and then item bonuses on top of that proficiency is going to be a lot more effective in his particular lane. As a spellcaster, lacking item bonuses is something you're going to feel when it comes to being effective. And that's why as a spellcaster you need to recognize that one of the most important things and one of the most powerful things that you have access to is diversification, flexibility, or attacking people with your spells in a variety of ways. I've talked about this in another video on this channel, and I'll throw a link up here in case you want to go and check that video out. But the simple thing to understand is this. Your enemies do not have one defense in the game. We often think of the defense of a creature as their armor class, and that is one defense they have access to, but it is hardly their only defense. Most creatures come with 4 defenses: armor class, fortitude save, reflex save, will save. And the great thing about being a caster is you are better equipped than non-caster classes to attack different defenses. A fighter that wants to attack an opponent's will save is probably going to need to invest in some skills and some skill feats to do so effectively. It's not impossible, but it's going to take the fighter some work to get there. Meanwhile, as a spellcaster, if you want to attack a target's will save, you just got to prepare it in one of your spell slots. It's pretty easy for you. You have diversity in how you attack your opponents. By simply changing out spells, or more specifically by preparing a variety of spells, you can attack an opponent's armor class, fortitude save, reflex save, and will save at your own discretion. Now, admittedly, you probably don't know at a glance exactly which of those 4 defenses is going to be the worst on any given creature. But it is important to note that there is usually some disparity in those defenses on every creature. Sometimes those disparities are minor, sometimes those disparities are major, but I've typically found that the disparity between the strongest and weakest defense on a creature in terms of successful save or successfully avoiding damage is typically between 10 to 20%, and in some extreme cases, the weakest defense of a creature can be 30 to 35% more likely to fail relative to its other defenses. So if you can target the weakest defense as a spellcaster, you are much more likely to be effective even when you compare to the fighter with all of his cool item bonuses. Now, an in-depth discussion of the weaknesses of every creature in the game, well beyond the scope of what we can talk about here, but there are a few things you can do. First and foremost, burn a recall knowledge action against new monsters. Ask your game master if you can attempt a knowledge check to identify which category of defense might be the weakest for a given monster. The majority of GMs would probably count that as relatively easy information to figure out when it comes to identifying creatures. And even if the game master doesn't let you make that roll, you can often make a pretty good educated guess. A creature in heavy adamantine armor probably has a good armor class. On the other hand, their reflex save might be suspect, given that they seem to rely so heavily on a bulky form of defense. Animals, beasts, they often have really weak will saves relative to other enemies at the same challenge level. And if the creature is skinny, it probably can't take a punch, and it probably doesn't have much in the way of fortitude saves. What I'm saying is, make the elf roll the fortitude save. It's funny. Taking a diversity of spells that might allow you to attack the 4 different defenses, and then using the right spell against the right enemy is going to go a long way into making you feel more effective as a spellcaster, and will make you feel a lot more powerful inside of the game. But there is one more point that I feel like we need to hit when it comes to diversification and flexibility, and that is accessing spells as a spellcaster. If there is one thing in Pathfinder 2e that hurts me, I'm going to be honest, this is the one thing in Pathfinder 2e where I struggle. It is the relative scarcity of bonus spells. In earlier editions of this game, it was relatively easy to get a pretty good selection of bonus spells. And in Pathfinder 2e, that fountain of bonus spells dried up fast. And if I'm being honest, as a long-term caster player, I felt that change and I felt it hard. If you are coming from other editions, this might be one of the areas where you are frustrated, and believe me, there's some sympathy on this subject. But Paizo was deliberate here too, and ultimately, the resources are not so lacking as we think. It's just that, as experienced players, we may have gotten too used to a particular source when it comes to accessing spells, to the point that we have neglected other options. In other words, a lot of people who play spellcasters have a bad habit of not using their wands, not using their staves, not using their scrolls, just ignoring these magical items that are very much intended for spellcasters. I actually remember years ago, I had a friend who was playing a D&D 3.5 game, and they were complaining about having trouble defeating a particular monster in their game, and their party had like challenged it and run away several times. And they came to me because they're like, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to beat this challenge our game master is throwing at us. And this particular creature was a powerful undead, by the way. And so I just said, do you realize how cheap a scroll of heal is? And the next time I saw my friend, they informed me they wiped the floor with that poor undead. They dropped a heal spell on that undead creature, and it was not long for this world. Wands, staves, and scrolls are designed to do one thing, one powerful thing, one important thing, and that is give you, the spellcaster, more spells to use. And over the years as gamers, a lot of us have developed a habit of not using them. I call it the megalixir fallacy. If you've ever played old Final Fantasy games, you may know what I'm talking about here. There used to be this item in Final Fantasy games called the megalixir, and it would give your entire team a full heal, full MP restore. It was one of the most powerful items in the game, and you never used them. Ever. They were too powerful. You might need them at some unknown point in the future, and even in the last fight of the game, you would still want to save the megalixir until later. You would never use the item that the game very clearly gave you as a resource to help you succeed. If you need more spells, wands, staves, and scrolls are the perfect avenue for getting more spells. Scrolls allow you to use a single spell one time whenever you might need it. Wands allow you to use a single spell once per day, and you can risk overcharging the wand if you need additional uses. And then staves allow you to access a number of different spells. Now, admittedly, staves work a little differently depending on which caster class you're using, but for any caster, scrolls, wands, and staves are all excellent resources that allow you to diversify your spell options. And the great thing is, with a single skill feat, the magical crafting skill feat, and a little bit of downtime, you can easily create a scroll, wand, or staff that you can use to diversify your spell selection. Is there a spell that you're probably not going to need every single adventure, but it's good to have it in your back pocket? Well, scribe a scroll of that spell during your downtime, and then, when you need it, pull it out. Is there a spell that you find useful frequently, but you worry about using up your precious spell slots for it every single day? Maybe a wand is the right choice. And then a magical staff? That can give you access to several different spells that you might find useful during the course of a day. These three tools are fantastic ways to make your spellcaster more flexible, and in turn, make them more powerful and impactful in play. But this video has gone on for quite some time, so I think we will leave this conversation on spellcasting here for today. I do plan to revisit this topic from time to time, and do some more in-depth dives on spellcasting and things to know if you want to be effective as a spellcaster in Pathfinder 2e. However, for today, I think we can definitely begin with these three basic principles. Number one, take the time to understand the purpose of your spellcasting and spell list. Number two, think about how your spells impact team play in your game. And number three, invest in class options and items that make you more flexible as a spellcaster so that you have more diversity in your spells and can more effectively target the weaknesses of your enemies. These three principles can go a long way in making you more effective as a spellcaster in your Pathfinder 2e games. I want to say thank you again to Drew from Team Player Gaming. I appreciate you taking some time to help me out on this video. And I want to say thank you again to all of the people over on the Pathfinder 2e Reddit who took the time to be a part of this conversation. Again, in the credits, I'm going to throw some names up. If I missed anybody, I am so sorry. There were a lot of people who chimed in on that, and I really appreciate all of the fantastic feedback that I got from that conversation. But speaking of conversations, let me go ahead and turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on playing spellcasters in Pathfinder 2e? Have you played a spellcaster, and have you struggled with being effective during game? What strategies and tips and suggestions would you have for someone who's interested in playing a spellcaster? And are there any tips that I overlooked in the concepts that we discussed in today's video? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. Subscribe to the channel for more conversations about TTRPGs. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation, and have a wonderful day.